The restaurant shimmered under soft chandeliers, the kind of place where laughter cost money. Waiters glided between tables, the air thick with perfume and power. But in the middle of it all sat a little girl, motionless. 8-year-old Elena Hale, daughter of billionaire Richard Hale, stared at her untouched plate. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Guests whispered, pretending not to notice. Her father's phone buzzed again. Business came first. No one spoke to her. No one saw her. Then, from across the room, a young waitress named Clara stopped. Her uniform was plain, her shoes worn, but her eyes were kind. She watched Elena trace invisible words in the air with her fingers, a silent cry for company. And then Clara did something no one else had done all night. She smiled and began to sign. For a heartbeat, the world went still. Then the girl's face bloomed into a joy that broke the room's coldness apart. Her father looked up, stunned. The billionaire who thought he'd seen everything had just seen love spoken in silence. If this moment touched you, pause for just 1 second and hit subscribe. Because every week, we share stories that remind you the smallest act of kindness can echo louder than wealth ever will. Stay with us, because what happens next will show that when hearts speak, even silence finds its voice. Before that night, Clara Jenkins lived a life most people walked past without noticing, just like they'd walked past her dreams. By day, she waited tables. By night, she studied under the faint buzz of a flickering lamp in her small, single-room apartment. Rent always late, shoes always thinning, but she carried something the world couldn't take from her: hope. Her mother used to tell her, kindness doesn't need money to be rich. But life had tested that belief. When her mother fell ill, Clara had to drop out of college to pay the hospital bills. She learned to smile through exhaustion, to apologize for things that weren't her fault, to survive one day at a time. She wasn't supposed to be at the restaurant that night. It was her co-worker's shift, but when he called in sick, she took it. Because every extra dollar mattered. Still, as she cleared those glittering tables, something inside her ached, a quiet awareness that people here had everything she didn't, yet seemed lonelier than she was. And when she saw Elena, sitting silent among laughter, something in her heart broke wide open. Because Clara understood that look. It was the look of someone unseen, someone unheard, and maybe, deep down, she saw a piece of herself in that little girl. What Clara didn't know was that her decision to stop and listen, without a single word, would soon change both their lives forever. Clara's hand moved gracefully through the air, signing words Elena hadn't heard in years. "Hi, are you okay?" The little girl's lips curved into the faintest smile. Her small fingers trembled before replying in sign, "You know how to talk like me?" Clara nodded. "My mom taught me. She used to teach kids who couldn't hear." That single moment cracked the wall between silence and sound. Elena giggled softly, her eyes glowing for the first time all night. Across the room, Richard Hale, her father, looked up from his phone. His brow furrowed. He wasn't used to seeing anyone approach his daughter without permission, especially not an employee. Clara realized too late that half the restaurant had gone quiet. The billionaire's security guards started moving toward her. She swallowed hard and stepped back, muttering, "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean." But before she could finish, Elena tugged at her father's sleeve and signed something urgently. The man turned back to Clara, his voice low but commanding. "What did my daughter just say to you?" Clara froze, her heart pounding. She looked at the little girl, then back at the man who owned half the city. She said, Clara's voice trembled. She said, "Thank you for hearing me." The billionaire stared, the kind of silence that feels heavier than words. His eyes softened for just a moment, but then he straightened his jacket. "Get back to work," he said coldly. Clara turned away, her heart sinking. But as she walked back toward the kitchen, she didn't see it. The way his expression lingered on her, conflicted. Because something about that girl's words had struck him too deeply to ignore. He thought it was over. But that small moment of kindness was only the beginning. The night moved on, but something in Richard Hale refused to settle. He kept glancing at the waitress, that same young woman who'd somehow made his daughter laugh after months of silence. When the last guests left, the restaurant quieted. Clara stood at the counter, wrapping leftover bread into small paper bags. She did this every night, one for herself, and one she'd leave near the alley for the homeless man who slept by the trash bins. Richard watched from his table, pretending to finish his coffee. He couldn't understand her. Most people worked for money. But this girl, she worked with heart. "Sir, your car is ready," his driver said softly. But Richard didn't move. His eyes were still on Clara. Later that week, he came back. No reservation. No entourage. Just him. Clara looked up, startled. "Oh, you again." He chuckled quietly. "You remember me." She smiled nervously. It's hard to forget someone who owns half the city. This time, Richard didn't sit alone. He sat across from her section and quietly watched her interact with customers. Patient, kind, genuine. When she wasn't looking, he slipped a folded napkin under the edge of his plate. When she cleared his table later, she unfolded it and froze. Inside was a note. "You speak to my daughter in a way no one has. Meet me tomorrow at noon." The next day, Clara arrived at the address scribbled beneath the note, expecting maybe a cafe, maybe a restaurant. But what she found was a private language academy for children with hearing loss. Richard was already inside, talking to the principal. When he turned and saw her standing in the doorway, their eyes met. "I donated this place years ago," he said quietly. "But I never actually came here." He looked down at his watch, then back at her. "Until last night, I forgot why it mattered." Clara looked around. Walls covered in bright posters, kids signing to each other joyfully. Her chest tightened. "This," she whispered. "This is beautiful." He smiled faintly. "It was my wife's idea." The softness in his voice cracked slightly. "What happened to her?" Clara asked gently. Richard's expression shifted, his jaw clenched, his gaze distant. "She was deaf," he said. "And she died giving birth to our daughter." The room seemed to shrink around them. Clara's hand tightened around her purse. The dots started connecting. Elena's silence. Richard's loneliness. His buried grief. But before she could speak, the door creaked open. A tiny voice whispered, "Daddy." Elena stood there, holding a crumpled piece of paper, and a drawing that made Clara's heart stop. It was the three of them, Elena, her father, and Clara, drawn together, as a family. And that's when everything started to change. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of laughter echoing from the children's classroom next door. Clara knelt beside Elena, her voice soft. "That's a beautiful drawing," she whispered. Elena nodded, her fingers signing. "I want us to be happy like this someday." Richard's eyes glistened. He looked away quickly, pretending to adjust his cufflinks. But Clara saw the tremor in his hands. After Elena was taken to play with the other children, Clara turned to him. "You've carried this alone for a long time, haven't you?" He hesitated. Then the words began to fall. Heavy, unguarded, true. "When my wife Anna died," he said quietly, "I couldn't even look at my daughter. She had her mother's eyes, her laugh, her silence. Everything about her reminded me of what I lost." He sank into a chair, staring at the floor. "I threw myself into work, building companies, buying buildings, pretending I was in control. But every night, when the house went quiet, the guilt came back." Clara sat across from him, her heart twisting. "You blamed yourself." He nodded. "I was supposed to be there. But I missed the call, a board meeting. She went into labor early, and I wasn't there when she took her last breath." His voice cracked, and for a brief second, the billionaire mask shattered. Clara leaned forward, her tone soft but firm. You couldn't save her, Richard. But you can still be there for the little girl she left behind. He looked up, his eyes searching hers. You don't understand. I've tried. I've hired the best tutors, therapists, private schools. Nothing reached her. Clara smiled sadly. Because she doesn't need perfection. She needs presence. Something shifted in his expression, the first flicker of understanding. He took a deep breath. You remind me of her, you know, Anna. Clara froze. Me. She was like you. Gentle, stubborn, too good for this world. He exhaled, shaking his head. She used to teach deaf children too. Clara's lips parted slightly. That's what my mother did. Richard looked at her sharply. Your mother? Clara nodded slowly. She was a sign language instructor. I grew up watching her teach kids to speak with their hands. After she passed, I promised myself I'd keep that part of her alive. For a moment, silence filled the space again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was sacred. 2 lives, one marked by guilt, one by grief, had just collided in a way that made neither feel so alone anymore. Richard stood, emotion thick in his throat. Clara, he whispered, you don't even know what you've done for me. Clara's voice was barely above a breath. Maybe it's not what I've done. Maybe it's what your daughter's been trying to do all along. He turned toward the window where Elena played, sunlight catching her small hands as she signed to another child. Richard whispered, more to himself than anyone else. She's been waiting for me to listen. He turned back to Clara, eyes glimmering, heart finally breaking open. And in that moment, both of them knew this wasn't coincidence. It was life giving them one last chance to make silence mean something again. The next few weeks brought quiet miracles. Every morning, Clara arrived at the Hale estate, not as a waitress, but as Elena's personal tutor. Richard had insisted on it. She learns best from people who actually see her, he'd said simply. The mansion, once cold and echoing with silence, began to sound alive again. Laughter, music, soft giggles echoing down its grand halls. Clara and Elena spent hours in the garden, signing, singing without sound. And slowly, Richard began to join them. One afternoon, Clara found him standing by the window, awkwardly shaping letters in the air with his hands. He looked at her sheepishly. I've been practicing, he admitted. I want to tell her, I love you, without saying a word. Clara smiled. Then show her. He stepped outside. Elena looked up from her drawing, curious. Richard knelt beside her and signed. Carefully, I love you. For a moment, Elena just stared. Then her eyes filled with tears, and she threw her arms around him. Clara turned away, wiping her own tears as the sunlight spilled across the lawn. It was in that moment that Richard realized the wealth he'd built could never buy what this woman had given him. Later that evening, he found Clara sitting by the piano, softly humming to herself. You've changed everything, he said quietly. She smiled, but shook her head. No, Richard. She changed you. I just helped you listen. He hesitated, then took a step closer. Clara, I don't want this to end when her lessons do. You've brought life back into this house. Into me. Clara looked down, her heart racing. You don't owe me anything. He smiled gently. That's the point. For the first time. I don't want to owe anyone anything. I just want to give back. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a letter of sponsorship, full tuition to complete her education and open her own sign language center. Clara's lips parted in disbelief. Richard, He raised a hand. Don't thank me. Just promise me one thing. She tilted her head. What? Keep doing what you do best, he said softly. Keep giving voices to those who can't be heard. Tears filled her eyes. I promise. From the doorway, Elena watched them, smiling. She ran forward, grabbing both their hands, and signed something that made them both laugh. "What did she say?" Richard asked. Clara smiled through tears. She said, "Can we be a family now?" The room went still. Richard looked at Clara, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He knelt beside his daughter and pulled both of them into a hug, whispering, "We already are." Sometimes, love doesn't begin with words. It begins when someone finally listens. Sometimes, it's not the grand gestures that change a life. It's the quiet moments, the listening hearts, the simple acts of kindness that no one else sees. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Click subscribe and join us at SoulTwist Stories, where every story begins with a whisper and ends with a lesson you'll never forget. Because the next story, it might just be the one that changes you.